So, Bret, it might be an obvious question, but it's a question that's not asked enough, and it's very simple, really. What is so special about human beings?
That is an excellent question. So, on the one hand, human beings are very much a product of evolution, and each of evolution's products is special in its own right. But we also have a particularly special version of special, which involves the offloading of a much larger percentage of our behavioral repertoire to the cultural layer. And that interplay between our genomes, which are in many ways quite standard, and our cultural layer, which is not matched by any other creature on Earth, that interplay is one that has to be dealt with very carefully as you're thinking evolutionarily, but it is really the key to our being able to do what no other creature on Earth has ever been able to do.
So you've been known as saying that genes build brains and culture fine-tunes those brains. Could you tell us a little bit more about how culture and genes, or how culture serves our genomes?
Sure, but the first thing to realize is that we are physiologically modified, and heavily so, to be able to have these brains which are largely not programmed at birth. Now, of course, they're not perfectly blank slates at all. I don't want to fall into that trap, but they are the blankest slates of any that have ever existed in any creature. And so why would our genomes have built brains that were capable of having what amounts to software loaded on after we are born at a much higher rate than any other creature? And the answer to that is closely tied with the recognition that human beings are capable of doing a much wider variety of things than any other creature. So if you think about all the things that human beings have discovered how to do, all of the niches that we inhabit, from fishing to farming to hunting and gathering, and all the variations within those categories, it is only possible to be a species with that diversity of behaviors because the software is auto-programming after we are born, rather than being a direct product of things written into our genomes.
So let's talk about some of that programming. So there is a relationship between human culture and the human genome, and you call that the omega principle. Could you just explain why that is so important?
So the idea is that there is an obligate relationship between our genomes and the cultural layer that they allow us to have. And that relationship involves two parts. The first part is relatively familiar to people who follow Richard Dawkins and the idea of memes, which is that culture is a very rapidly evolving landscape. But the second part is less familiar, and in fact hasn't been properly spelled out, which is that there's a hierarchical relationship between our genomes and our culture. Our culture is subordinate to our genomes in terms of the objectives that it has to serve. And that's really not a happy thing to communicate, because the subjugation of our cultures to our genomes' interests actually pits us against each other in a way that is unhealthy under the best of circumstances and downright lethal when you have the kinds of technologies at your disposal that modern humans do. So if we are to survive the 21st century, we're going to have to grapple with the fact that we are culturally innovating mechanisms to serve our genome's interests, and that in some sense we have to take our genomes out of the driver's seat.
One of those interests that our genomes have is that of growth, and it seems to be an innate want to constantly, as human beings, grow into other environments. And there's three ways in which that happens, aren't there?
So there's nothing particularly human about the addiction to growth. Effectively, there is a drive to find unexploited opportunities and to exploit them, and that's true for all creatures. But it looks very different if you're a dandelion moving into a valley that doesn't have a direct competitor versus a human being that has more tools at its disposal with which to make growth occur. So growth can occur in multiple fashions. The first one, the most obvious, frontier, and growth and frontier are two concepts that I think should be closely aligned. The first kind of frontier is a literal geographic frontier where a human population can find a landmass that doesn't have human competitors in it or is otherwise hospitable to the growth of that population. That population can enter that landscape and it can make use of what opportunities are there and grow to what's called carrying capacity, which is the limit of that habitat to support creatures. The second kind of frontier is a technological frontier, where instead of finding a new landmass, one finds a new mechanism for exploiting the same piece of territory, and population then again grows based on the fact that that piece of territory can support more individuals. And then the third one of these frontiers is actually only a frontier if you view it through the lens of an individual population. And this is a transfer frontier, where a population discovers that by robbing another population of whatever it has, that it can increase the well-being of the population doing the transferring. And so this is not a frontier if one thinks across both populations. It's zero sum. One population loses and the other gains. But if we are pitted against each other in population against population competition, then the discovery that some population can't defend what it has is an opportunity to create growth. And that, again, is something that we have to fight off, that we are built to seek these things. And worse, we are built to rationalize doing it. So one doesn't transfer the wealth from another population by acknowledging that that's what you're doing. What we do is we dehumanize the other population in order to justify that transfer.
So this is why, at least I think, this conversation is super important at this point in time, because we've seen this rapid expansion, this rapid growth in the 20th century, but it almost feels like as we approach and encroach onto the 21st century, there's a slowing down of that ability to grow. And I wonder if we're coming to an end of a particular boom, what that means for us as human beings and our relationships to each other.
Yeah, the answer is it's not good news unless we wake up to it and decide to do something about it. So we've been doing something novel, something our ancestors really didn't have the opportunity to do, which is to transfer wealth effectively from future inhabitants of the earth. And we have made the present relatively comfortable by robbing people who don't exist yet and therefore can't speak for themselves. But we're also running up against the limit of our ability to do that. 7.5 billion people is a large number of people to inhabit this planet. And the voracious appetite that we have for consumer goods is basically liquidating the well-being of the planet, the present well-being and the future well-being. And so we're going to have to recognize that that is simply mathematically unstable. And we have to address what's causing it rather than embrace these cornucopian fantasies that we will continue to find our way through bottlenecks by discovering new technologies, because some of those technologies will work and others will turn out to have terrible downsides that we will ultimately experience the costs of.
Do you think right now we're still at that convincing stage where we're believing that we're going to get through the bottlenecks because of technology? It's going to be okay. The future will save us. So let's not worry in the present.
Well, I mentioned before the problem of rationalization, and I think in some sense we've got a game theory problem, and I've increasingly come to believe that game theory is the subject that we all really ought to study, because most of our problems can be resolved to relatively canonical ones if you can learn to spot the issue. But we have essentially a collective action problem whereby those individuals that embrace the idea that we will find technologies to get us through the bottleneck free themselves from obligation. And those who recognize that we won't get through the bottleneck on our present trajectory add extra obligation to themselves. And so the best deal available is to be a cornucopian and imagine that you don't have obligations because the new technologies always come to save us just in time, and let others figure out what we're really going to do about it, because then you get the benefits of the solutions without paying the cost of supporting them yourself. So in some sense, we have to recognize that an individual is rational to pretend that we are in a better situation than we are. That individual has the best of both worlds. If the world is saved by some new plan and they don't have to invest in building the plan, then they'll be able to transition with the rest of us.
What's the other option? What's the other option? If it's not going through, is it essentially tyranny?
Well, I have argued that tyranny is the end game of prosperity, and that at the point that the growth frontiers run out, we effectively turn on each other. And that is basically the meaning. That's what transfer frontiers look like, is populations challenging each other for access to resources. That tyranny, though, is going to be different this time because the number of us is much higher, the interconnectedness of all of the populations of the Earth is much greater, and the technologies at our disposal are much more powerful. And so, in effect, this is the perfect storm whereby those processes where populations become tribal and confront each other is now set up to be lethal to all of us, that we are hooked together in such a way that we just simply can't afford a descent into tyranny. We won't survive it. So that's bad. On the other hand, perhaps it sets us up to substitute the jeopardy that we all experience together for the one thing that tends to cause humans to unite with each other, which is an enemy that is worth collaborating to fend off. And in this case, the enemy is a little odd. The enemy is us, and we need to fend it off together. But if we can spot it for what it is, then we actually are built to put aside our differences and confront the problem together. And if we did that, I'm pretty sure we would find ourselves living in an incredibly vibrant era, one that was really fascinating to be alive for. And, you know, the picture that we are often sold is that to confront the problems of the Earth is to face massive austerity. And in some sense, I think that's just unlikely to be true. And if we understood how interesting it would be to live in an era where we were really confronting the chronic problems of humanity once and for all, we might be really eager to get there. It could be quite a thing.
Do you think we will have the time to see those chronic problems come over the horizon, or do you think it'll be something more instantaneous? Do you think we won't evolve ourselves out of this issue? The only option is either self-destruction or annihilation through some sort of existential risk.
Well, I'm concerned. When I was younger, I used to imagine that it was going to take some substantial catastrophe to wake us up. And we've now seen some substantial catastrophes, and we haven't woken up.
Such as?
Well, Katrina should have woken Americans up pretty clearly. Fukushima, I think, it has a very clear message for us about externality and about unintended consequences and about our economic systems. And we don't wake up. And so something else is afoot that is preventing us from having the natural reaction to these things that we should have. And it has something to do with the alterations, I think largely technological alterations, in the way we relate to each other. So I think relatively mundane aspects of our social media environment are actually affecting the way we construct our narrative of what's taking place. They're serving the algorithms that are managing who we talk to and what messages get through are, in effect, constructing a very simple story that isn't right. And that, I think it may block us from actually having the proper reaction to the present triggered so that we can actually respond coherently to our situation.
Do you think that, with regards to social media, do you think that's the thing that's defining the tribe? So instead of looking at ourselves as a global tribe i.e. humanity, social media is a thing that is forcing us in to smaller communities based on whether it's identity politics, which I know you've been involved with, or the nation state. Do you think that that has become the survival mechanism? It's no longer about us collectively as 7 billion, but us individually in our smaller communities. What is the political problem that may arise from that, and how do we avoid sort of doubling down into smaller tribes that will inevitably, as you've said, end up fighting?
Well, it's done a number of things. We're watching the assembly of coalitions that aren't in and of themselves coherent. And so those coalitions actually may be temporarily quite useful in terms of gaining power, but game theory tells us that they'll come apart as soon as they win that power. More or less as they're dividing the spoils, they will faction. So that's not a long-term process. But what I think is more troubling than the coalitions is we've all talked about echo chambers, but there's a way in which the economic system that manages the Goliaths that manage our social universe, they have perverse incentives. And because they are in competition with each other, they have to figure out how to keep our attention rather than having us move on to some other platform. And that competition for attention makes them tell us what we want to hear rather than what we need to know. And that distinction is a very important one. So they reinforce our biases rather than challenging them. And the question really is, can we bring about a conversation that does tell us what we need to know without the algorithms dicing it up and making it break down? So I'm hopeful that that's possible, but it's not entirely clear how that can function when virtually all of these conversations are mediated by privately held adaptive algorithms that have very narrow economic interests.
So right now, forget nuclear war, forget nanotechnology, forget synthetic biology. The real challenge, the real existential risk is Facebook.
Well, maybe, or the way I prefer to think of it,
or Twitter, one or the other.
We face a great many grave threats. And if you view them as independent, then it's quite daunting. If you view them as symptoms of a small number of causes, probably causes that don't have a name yet, then they become tractable, because really what you're after is something, not a solution to the problem of nuclear waste building up at reactors that requires vigilance to keep it from escaping into the environment. But if the problem is the way we assess risk in an environment where we're using, 18th century tools to manage 21st century problems, then we can address all of these things together without having to understand the details in each one as independent